Woo!
All right, I know what you're going to think. Another talk about DAOs. It's been the theme. But obviously, I mean, they're the underlying structure, I think, that enables a lot of the crypto use cases and Web3 things that we want to see happen. So it's really important, I think, that we, really start to experiment, but also talk about, the best systems that are available for us to actually make these things happen. So my talk specifically is about a topic that's a little bit under discussed and actually something that we're just now kind of like really seeing starting to spin up. It's meta governance. So, essentially the concept of entities or communities voting on external governance processes to theirs, which is really interesting because it kind of like shifts the governance paradigm on its head a little bit, and we'll dive into it. But this presentation specifically talks about how that framework can actually usher in true stakeholder capitalism. And it's something that traditional corporations have talked about for ages. How can we properly represent the wants and needs of our stakeholder set of our community, not just their shareholders? But we've seen very, very little action, so we'll dive into that. At the end of the day, I think that DAOs, through meta governance, can make other DAOs accountable to their purpose. So, shareholder governance, has always put the shareholder in the center of the equation. Obviously, it's pretty simple. Make as much money or die. Pretty easy. But it's very short-sighted, right? When it comes to representing the wants and needs of the broader set of community members, stakeholders. Everyone's heard about this. Larry Fink puts out a annual shareholder letter about this that talks about how they want to push a prep of like good governance in the companies that they have influence in, and they want to push for climate change and representative kind of like stakeholders. At the end of the day, though, we've seen very, very little action here, right? So it's really given way to a lack of coordination and transparency when it comes to truly representing stakeholders, the broader subset of stakeholders. So now we reach DAOs, right? So DAOs are completely reinventing coordination, completely reinventing how we think about allocating talent and capital. And as more and more activity shifts into the digital realm, and we've seen that be incredibly accelerated by things like COVID, et cetera, it becomes really important that we develop these frameworks in order to essentially actually be able to communicate and coordinate in the web space, the internet age, whatever you want to call it. As you guys can see from this graph, the 2020 chart is one I put up, I think when, it must have been May 2020, and that was like what I saw as the DAO landscape back then. Obviously, that's exploded in the last year, and I don't even want to think about what it's going to look like in 6 months, probably won't fit in the slide. But at the end of the day, DAOs are just frameworks, right? They're just frameworks to make decisions, to essentially establish rules that are enforced on-chain, sometimes off-chain, but create a governance mechanism for us to be able to communicate and coordinate with each other. The thing that DAOs aren't, though, they're not mechanisms to actually scale products, scale community, build very specific things. So predictable issues have popped up, right, when it comes to scaling these communities, scaling these different products. Essentially, there's too many operational decisions for governors or stakeholders to actually be involved in all of them. The volume's too high. There's a lack of specialization as well. There's a lot of folks that may not be knowledgeable, right? If you have 10,000 different holders with governance power over a network, it's very unlikely that everyone knows everything about how to run or operate that DAO. And there's just general apathy, right? In general, token holders, stakeholders, governors, they don't care. I mean, how many people actually care about governance day in, day out? You really only care when you really have to care, right? So anyway, we've seen all of this happen, and over the last 6 months to a year, we've seen the DAOs have really started to outsource responsibility and governance power, both internally, but most importantly, externally as well. So internally, we saw the rise of what we call governance 2.0, with some DAOs like Yearn and Index, et cetera, developing internal working groups. So these are akin to departments, right? Skeuomorphic ideas that we're transferring over from the corporate world and saying, hey, why don't we actually structure ourselves with departments that specialize and delegate responsibility to them. This can be marketing, BD, product, et cetera, depending on what the DAO does. But really interestingly, though, we've seen this, the rise of external outsourcing of responsibility. And this comes, with these new types of entities that some people are calling sub-DAOs, service providers, whatever you want to call them. But they're essentially spinning up to service the DAOs and help them scale, in a variety of different ways, and we'll dive into some of those. As well as we're also seeing some nonprofit foundations, different initiatives, et cetera, also spin up to try to push different mandates or enable kind of like community members to, climb the ladder, a number of different things. Sheet 256, for example, is a great example of that. They're really involved in the governance of a lot of DAOs as well. So, this is unlocking some of their treasuries, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what's important to remember is that we're seeing kind of like a breakdown in the traditional theory of the firm, right? The entire reason why the firm exists is to reduce external transaction costs. And you have this firm boundary, right? So you can actually have the flexibility internally within that corporate structure to be able to communicate and coordinate talent and capital. Now we're seeing that break down a little bit because DAOs are transparent, they're open, they remove that boundary a little bit so that external cost is greatly reduced as well when transacting DAO to DAO or business to DAO, which is really interesting because we're seeing an evolution from just like a traditional corporate structure to a hub and spoke model, which was governance 2.0 that we talked about with those departments, to just a networked model where you get all of these transactions and DAOs interacting with each other in a very, very flat structure, which is super interesting. And most importantly, though, all of these service providers, all these DAOs, et cetera, these sub-DAOs, they're actually aggregating governance power now, which is really exciting. So over the last 6 months, we've seen that, I'm using 2 examples here of amazing DAOs that are essentially leading the pack in the meta governance realm. Rabbit Hole, for example, offers an onboarding service, a marketing service, and customer acquisition service for DAOs to be able to onboard new participants through very simple tasks. They actually charge the DAO treasuries through governance. And they may charge them $100K and they take a 20% fee of that. And that goes into the Rabbit Hole treasury. That treasury is now holding native governance tokens of that DAO they've interacted with. So suddenly Rabbit Hole is now a governor, a stakeholder, a community member of whatever DAO they just serviced. Similarly, Index develops index products as well that hold a ton of underlying governance tokens. And these underlying governance tokens obviously have power. The Index Meta Governance token actually enables anyone in that community to vote on external governance systems. So Index members can actually vote on how to vote on a Uniswap proposal. So suddenly, you start to get this interesting diversity in like perspectives and interests all interacting in a governance system. Now it's not only just internal stakeholders or shareholders, et cetera, trying to push governance forward. Now you also have the service providers, nonprofit foundations, all these different types of entities actually pushing their goals and their own mandate in that individual DAO. So I actually expect to see that every single DAO is going to have a meta governance pod, essentially an arm that just focuses on external governance. And the majority of stakeholders of DAOs or governors of DAOs that are actually holding power won't necessarily be individuals, but just entities, that actually have their own mandate, their own community, their own governance process as well. So all these providers, customers, et cetera, they become community members. And then they in turn want to uphold the interests of their own constituents in these external communities too, which gets really interesting. Another benefit of this as well is that it creates a very, very modular breeding ground for governance experimentation. Right now you have 2 separate governance systems actually talking to each other, interacting with each other. As an example, the Index DAO votes on Snapshot, and then they execute that vote on whatever governance framework that underlying token uses. That could be Compound Governor Bravo smart contracts. That could be an Aragon DAO. It could be a number of different things, which means that we're separating the process into 2 kind of like modular steps. And it creates an interesting experimentation layer, but also a very interesting defense line against like unchecked power necessarily, because now you're separating that entire process into 2 modular steps. Another very important thing that it creates is much better accountability, in stark contrast to like traditional corporate structures where you have a very small number of controlling proxies with the same interests, make as much money as possible, even though they don't talk about that too much out in public now. In the corporate world, in the corporate governance world, 2 firms, this is for the Fortune 500, just 2 firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, which dominate like 98% of that market share, they're proxy advisory firms. So they essentially provide services to brokers, et cetera, and help them vote on different governance proposals on the underlying assets they create. It's been calculated, this was from a Harvard Review Journal article, that those 2 firms actually control nearly 38% of all shareholder votes in the Fortune 500. That's insane, right? Because these 2 firms essentially have the same mandate, make as much money as possible for shareholders, and have no diversity in opinion and thought, et cetera, and the brokers essentially just take their recommendations and execute them. This is obviously not the best way to represent stakeholders, right? The broader community. And the proxy advisory firms have dominated this corporate governance world. honestly, there's no reason why this couldn't also happen in crypto. If voters are passive and just delegate the responsibility completely away as individuals, right? As individuals, we don't really care that much about all these governance votes, et cetera. We delegate that responsibility away. It's very likely that that power is actually going to end up concentrating in these types of proxies as well. It can easily happen in crypto, right? So what we're seeing these new sub-DAOs, external DAOs become are kind of like coordination institutions, right? So instead of the individual now having to delegate that responsibility away or make those decisions, it's actually a DAO, right? It's like the rabbit hole DAO, the index DAO that has its own process to make these external decisions and pushes their mandate onto these external parties. So it's just a framework, right? Instead of individuals, now we're talking about entities. However, it's super, super important that there's transparency and accountability to this entire process, right? If these external DAOs or other DAOs don't know what's going on in the other processes or governance systems, then that opacity will cause all of this to be completely worthless, right? So we at Boardroom actually see information, data, transparency as kind of like the cornerstone to all of this to be able to map, these proper systems in place. But right now, what we have is that governance interactions are very fragmented, right? What we have is, in the Web3 space, we develop these amazing open source primitives, sets of smart contracts, sets of governance systems, et cetera, that are fully forkable, fully customizable. What you end up getting is a lot of different standards, right? Which is great for DAO experimentation and governance experimentation, but really bad for UX and data transparency. So this explosive demand in DAOs is essentially driving all of these open source primitives to be developed, all these different governance systems to be built as well. And as the myth of the infrastructure goes, essentially kind of like apps and infrastructure develop in responsive cycles. So we're seeing all of this tooling come to market now. That creates a lot of fragmentation at the framework layer, the governance system layer, which means that if we really want to enable meta-governance and DAOs to talk to each other, we need some sort of like glue or standard way to actually read all of this governance information and actually compare it apples to apples, right? All of this diversity and custom frameworks, et cetera. A DAO can pick and choose to build on top of any of these. And by the way, this is just a small sample of like some of the ones that we look at Boardroom. There's hundreds more coming to market, which is amazing for experimentation, really bad for user interactions and the DAO communication layer. So I'm the founder of Boardroom. We're building a governance aggregator platform on top of all these open source primitives that just standardizes how all this data is consumed, read, et cetera, to just open up a little bit of that transparency so meta governance can really flourish in this kind of like new networked model and structure. So we're actually launching a new dashboard next week, and we're enabling any address who's ever voted on any governance proposal of any of the DAOs that we support to mint an NFT to actually access the dashboard. So you would be initial founding governor members of the new Boardroom dashboard as well. And as was mentioned before, this dashboard provides a single interface for you to actually be able to view, interact, and govern over these DAOs as well, not only for the individual, but for the other DAOs as well. So we're going to see this network model evolve. Hopefully, Boardroom can help in that mission. Thank you. Appreciate it. I can take questions if anyone has anything, or if not, I'll obviously be in the back too. Yeah. Yeah, so we're really focused on reporting, right? So just the initial step, create transparency on data and reporting. By the way, the question was the legality and all that stuff around actual meta governance too. It's really interesting because if DAOs actually hold other governance tokens in their treasuries, that essentially means that they are now kind of like shareholders or stakeholders in those other external DAOs. Right now, we're kind of like leaving that up to the lawyers. We're focusing on just transparency and reporting because if you don't even know what's going on in the first place with these votes, then we don't even know what frameworks to build around kind of like proper jurisdictional oversight and tax implications.